All right, welcome to another deep dive, and today things are going to get pretty deep as we tackle Fyodor Dostoyevsky.
Oh, yeah.
From what I can tell, just glancing over the source material, this one's going to be a real doozy.
That's going to be a big one, yeah.
So thanks again to you out there for sending us the Fyodor Dostoyevsky Complete Collection.pdf. It looks like a really fascinating collection of essays by some real Dostoyevsky experts, and we're going to see if we can extract the main ideas here.
Yeah, I'm excited to jump into this one. This is a really, really rich collection of different perspectives on Dostoevsky. And like you said, it's not just literary criticism. You've got philosophy, you've got theology, you've got history of ideas all kind of swirling together.
Yeah, it's the real deal, and that's what we like to do here at the Deep Dive. So let's jump right in.
Now let's do it.
I think one of the first things that really struck me looking over these essays is this tension that Dostoevsky seemed to feel between, the rising power of science in the 19th century and all these other modes of inquiry, religious, philosophical, aesthetic even.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And I think, one of the things that emerges from several of these essays is this, we see Dostoevsky through characters like Shatov, voicing this pretty strong critique of what he sees as the overreach of science. And so Shatov talks about this idea of science imposing fist-enforced solutions, and this idea that, there's this one kind of truth that science is, claiming to have discovered, and it's being imposed on everyone whether they like it or not. And he also talks about, half science, which I think suggests this kind of superficial or even dogmatic application of scientific principles without really deeper understanding of what's really going on.
Yeah, I mean, I can already hear like the echoes of this in our own time, right? Where you have these pronouncements about the science, this is the way things are, and shut up and listen to what we're saying.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see these kind of anxieties that Dostoevsky was already expressing back in the 19th century. And I think, connects to this broader phenomenon we call scientism, right? Which is this idea that the scientific method is, the only valid way of knowing anything about reality.
Right.
And so maybe it's worth just pausing for a second and sort of defining that for our listeners, right? Scientism, this idea that, only science can give us truth, and anything else, philosophy, religion, morality, it's all kind of subjective nonsense.
Yeah, and Dostoevsky is writing, right at the moment when science is achieving, just this tremendous amount of prestige, right? It's unlocking all these secrets of the universe.
Absolutely. The 19th century is like the century of science really coming into its own. And Dostoevsky is, he's not anti-science by any means, but he's very attuned to the potential limitations of this kind of very narrow scientific worldview.
Right. And I think that's where his, what he called realism in a higher sense comes into play. So what is that all about, and why should we care?
So realism in a higher sense, it's a really fascinating idea. And it's Dostoevsky's attempt to say, look, we can't just limit ourselves to empirical facts, to what we can see and measure in the world.
Yeah.
Like there's a deeper level of reality, and he calls it the realm of essences, right? And that's really what's important for understanding human beings.
Right. So he's not saying that empirical facts are wrong or unimportant. It's just that they don't tell the whole story.
Exactly. And he had this great quote in his Diary of a Writer where he says, one must depict reality as it is, they say, where such reality does not exist, because the essence of things is inaccessible to man. Therefore, one has to give more room to the idea and not to be afraid of the ideal.
So he's not just trying to describe, the surface appearance of things. He's trying to get at that deeper meaning that lies beneath.
That's it. He wants to capture the soul, the inner turmoil, the spiritual yearnings of his characters. And it's not enough to just describe their behavior. You have to understand their motivations, their beliefs, their hopes and fears.
Right. And I think that's a big part of why Dostoevsky's novels continue to resonate with readers even today, over 150 years later.
Absolutely, because he's tapping into these timeless human questions, these deep existential concerns that go beyond the surface level of things.
Right. And then I think, another important point here is that Dostoevsky was writing at a time when, the ideas of Darwin were really starting to take hold in the intellectual world.
Oh, absolutely. Darwin's theory of evolution had a huge impact on 19th century thought. And Dostoevsky was very much aware of this. And I think for him, the big question was, okay, well, what does this mean for human beings, right? What does it mean for our understanding of ourselves?
Yeah, especially with the rise of social Darwinism, where, people were starting to apply these, biological principles to to society in some pretty brutal ways sometimes.
Right, and so you have thinkers like Herbert Spencer, right, who are taking Darwin's ideas about natural selection and survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
And they're saying, okay, well, this is how society should be organized too, right? The strong should prosper and the weak should be, weeded out.
And Dostoevsky is deeply skeptical of this whole line of thinking, right?
Yeah, I think he sees the danger in reducing human behavior to, purely biological drives and ignoring, the spiritual and moral dimensions of human existence.
Right. He's worried about this kind of like, mechanical and slavish application of Darwinian ideas to human society.
I think that's a great way to put it. And we see this concern coming out in a lot of his novels, right? This idea that if you reduce human beings to, just biological machines,
Yeah.
that we lose sight of what's truly human about us. The capacity for love, for compassion, for sacrifice, all of these things that go beyond, just the struggle for survival.
Right. And so it's not that he's necessarily rejecting Darwin's ideas outright, but he's very much aware of the potential dangers of misinterpreting them or misapplying them.
Absolutely. And I think, that's one of the things that makes him so relevant today, because we're still grappling with these same questions, right? About the role of science, the nature of human beings, the relationship between biology and morality. So moving on from this sort of tension with science, another big theme that comes up in these essays is this whole question of faith and atheism, right? And it's almost paradoxical that Dostoevsky, as a devout Christian, would create these characters who are wrestling so intensely with the non-existence of God. Yeah, it's one of the things that's so fascinating about him, right? He doesn't shy away from the really tough questions, and he allows his characters to voice these very powerful arguments for atheism, and not as straw men to be easily defeated, but as real agonizing doubts that he himself seems to have grappled with.
Oh, right. And one of the essays in this collection introduces this really interesting idea of writing ahead of one's faith versus writing behind one's faith. And this is particularly interesting when you compare Dostoevsky to someone like Nietzsche.
Yeah, that's a great point. So this idea comes from David Cunningham, and what he's getting at is, writing behind one's faith is when you essentially start with a set of beliefs, and your writing is kind of like a defense of those beliefs, right? So you might see this in in theological treatises or in works of apologetics, where the author is really trying to to prove the truth of their particular doctrine.
Right.
Nietzsche, on the other hand, who was a very outspoken critic of Christianity, you could argue that he was writing behind his unfaith. Right, that he's starting from this position of, God is dead, and everything that follows is kind of like a working out of the implications of that.
Right.
But Dostoevsky is different. He's not starting with a set of answers. He's starting with questions.
Yeah.
Right? And he's allowing his characters to really wrestle with these questions in a very authentic way. And so Cunningham calls this writing ahead of one's faith.
Yeah.
It's like you're on this kind of intellectual and spiritual journey, and you don't know where you're going to end up.
Yeah, it's this idea that the creative process itself is a form of inquiry.
Exactly. And I think, Cunningham connects this to this distinction between history and Geschichte, right?
Yeah.
So history is just the bare facts, the chronological record of events.
Right.
But Geschichte is the story, right? It's the meaning, it's the significant, it's the impact of those events.
Right. And that's really what Dostoevsky is interested in, right?
Absolutely. He's not just interested in the surface details of his characters' lives. He's interested in the deeper spiritual drama that's playing out beneath the surface.
And I think that's a big part of why his novels are so compelling, right? Because he's not giving us easy answers. He's inviting us to participate in this struggle with him.
Yeah, he's really forcing us to confront these ultimate questions about the meaning of life, the existence of God, the nature of good and evil.
And this brings us right into this whole realm of morality and freedom, right? And I think one of the most famous lines from Dostoevsky is Ivan Karamazov's declaration that if there's no immortality of the soul, everything is lawful.
Yeah, that's a really provocative statement, and I think it gets at this deep anxiety that runs through a lot of Dostoevsky's work, right? This idea that if there is no God, if there's no ultimate moral authority, then what's to stop us from doing whatever we want?
Right.
And one of the essays in this collection, Charles Armour's analysis of Dostoevsky as a moral philosopher, really dives into this question, and he focuses on this famous confrontation in the Brothers Karamazov between the Grand Inquisitor and Christ.
Right.
And Larmor argues that this scene is really about two different conceptions of human freedom, right? So
Yeah.
you have radical freedom, which is the freedom of conscience, the freedom to choose your own beliefs and actions, even if it means, going against the grain.
Right.
And then you have what he calls instrumental freedom, which is this more kind of pragmatic freedom, the freedom to have your material needs met, the freedom from anxiety and suffering.
Right. So the Grand Inquisitor is basically arguing that most people are not really equipped for radical freedom.
Exactly. He's saying
Mhm.
that, give people bread, give them security, give them someone to tell them what to do, and they'll be happy. And Christ's response, of course, is to offer this much more challenging vision of freedom, right?
Mhm.
This freedom that comes at a cost, this freedom that requires us to take responsibility for our own choices.
Right. And I think, going back to Ivan's statement about everything being lawful if there's no immortality of the soul,
Yeah.
Laura Moore makes this really interesting point that even Ivan's arguments against God, which are often rooted in this problem of innocent suffering, right? Why would God allow innocent children to suffer if he's all good and all powerful?
Yeah.
Even those arguments kind of presuppose a sense of justice, a sense of morality that Ivan is simultaneously trying to deny.
That's a very subtle, but I think very important point,
Yeah.
right? That even in his most passionate denunciations of God,
Mm.
Ivan is still relying on moral principles that he's claiming don't exist.
Right. So there's this kind of like inherent contradiction in his position.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that Dostoevsky is so brilliant at, right? Is showing us the complexity, the contradictions, the paradoxes of human thought.
Right. And another essay by Kabalnik kind of delves into the broader philosophical context of Ivan's statement, and he connects it to these ideas of Ludwig Feuerbach and Max Stirner.
Yeah, so Kabbalic is really helping us to understand, where Dostoevsky is coming from intellectually. And so Feuerbach, he's this German philosopher who argued that God is essentially a projection of human desires and fears.
Right. So we've created God in our own image.
Exactly. And Stirner goes even further, right? He's this radical individualist who basically says, the only thing that matters is the individual ego and the
Mhm.
pursuit of self-enjoyment. And so any kind of external moral constraints are just an infringement on our freedom.
Right. So Dostoevsky is very much aware of these ideas that are circulating in the intellectual world of his time, and he's engaging with them in a very sophisticated way.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that Kabalnik helps us to see is that Dostoevsky is not just, refuting these ideas in a kind of simplistic way, but he's really wrestling with them.
Yeah.
He's trying to understand their appeal. He's trying to see, what is it about these ideas that speaks to people?
And what is his counter argument? What is his response to this idea that everything is lawful if God doesn't exist?
So both Kabalnik and another essay by Jackson emphasize this idea that for Dostoevsky, acts of love produce faith.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not necessarily intellectual assent that leads to faith, but rather a kind of lived commitment to love and ethical behavior.
So it's about action. It's about how we live our lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the things that Dostoevsky seems to be suggesting is that, even if we can't prove the existence of God rationally, there's something about the experience of love, the experience of compassion, the experience of sacrificing for others that points beyond ourselves,
Yeah.
that gives us a glimpse of something transcendent.
And that's something that, I think we can all relate to in our own lives, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've all had those moments where, we've experienced love or compassion in a way that's just felt so powerful, so real that it's hard to explain it away in purely materialistic terms.
All right, so shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about Dostoevsky's relationship with art, because this is another really important theme that comes up in several of these essays. And one of the most interesting examples is his reaction to Hans Holbein's painting The Dead Body of Christ in the Tomb.
Oh yeah, this is a fascinating episode in Dostoevsky's life, and Jackson's essay really dives into this. And what he helps us to see is that, Dostoevsky believed that art had this incredible power to convey truth,
Right.
but not just, naturalistic truth,
Right.
not just the accurate representation of the physical world,
Right.
but a kind of higher artistic truth
Yeah.
that could reveal something about the spiritual or the metaphysical dimensions of reality.
And Jackson brings in this idea of formed formlessness from Augustine to to help us understand this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept, right? So Augustine talks about this kind of primordial state of unshaped potential right before the imposition of form.
Right.
And I think what Jackson is getting at is that Dostoevsky was drawn to art that grappled with the raw, the unsettling aspects of reality, right? The things that don't fit neatly into our preconceived notions of beauty or order.
And Holbein's painting with its very stark and realistic depiction of Christ's dead body. I mean, it's a very powerful image, and it seems to have really shaken Dostoevsky.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine, seeing this painting in the 19th century would have been quite shocking because it's so different from the traditional, idealized images of Christ that people were used to seeing.
Right.
And Dostoevsky's wife, Anna Grigorievna Dostoyevsky, she records her own reaction to the painting.
Yeah.
And she talks about how horrified she was by it, how it just filled her with this sense of dread. And the idiot Prince Mishkin famously suggests that this painting could actually shake one's faith.
But Dostoevsky's own reaction is more complicated than that, right?
Yeah, it's not just revulsion or horror. It's a kind of a deep intellectual and spiritual engagement with the painting. And Jackson emphasizes that, Dostoevsky was really wrestling with the pro and contra of the painting, right? The arguments for and against its significance.
And he sees in it this kind of momentous depth of speculation.
Exactly. It's like this painting is not just a depiction of a dead body. It's a profound statement about the challenges to faith in a seemingly godless world.
And I think that's a big part of why art is so important for Dostoevsky, right?
Absolutely, because he sees art as this space where these ultimate questions can be explored in a way that goes beyond just the rational or the philosophical.
Right. Art has this power to move us, to challenge us, to make us think in new ways.
And I think that's one of the reasons why Dostoevsky's novels continue to be so powerful today, because they're not just stories, right? They're works of art that are grappling with these really big questions about the meaning of life, the nature of reality, the existence of God.
And another essay by Orwin also points out that Dostoevsky saw art as not just reflecting its age, but actually shaping it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And he talks about this in his essay, Mr. Bov and the Question of Art. And I think for Dostoevsky, art was not just a kind of passive mirror of reality, but it was an active force that could actually transform the world.
So let's move on to another really fascinating aspect of Dostoevsky's work, and that's his exploration of the mystery of consciousness and identity.
Yeah, this is a really deep rabbit hole, and I think one of the things that comes out in these essays is that Dostoevsky had a very different understanding of consciousness than, say, a purely scientific materialist viewpoint would suggest.
So what was his take on this?
Well, Morrison's chapter in the collection really dives into this, and he argues that for Dostoevsky, consciousness wasn't just, a biological process or a collection of data.
Right.
It always inherently involved a point of view, a subjective experience that can't be fully captured by objective materialistic descriptions of the world.
Right. So it's not just about, the physical workings of the brain, but about this inner experience of being a self.
Exactly. And this is where his use of doubles and ambiguous characters in his novels becomes really interesting, right?
Right. So why does he do that?
Because I think he's trying to get at this very question of identity and consciousness, right? How can two people look alike but have completely different inner worlds?
Right. And Morrison uses these thought experiments like the amoeba problem and the idea of Siamese twins to kind of illustrate this point.
Yeah, so the amoeba problem is this idea of, imagine you have an amoeba and you split it in half, right?
Right.
Do you now have two amoebas, or is it still one amoeba that's just been divided? Yeah, it's a mind bender.
And the idea of Siamese twins is even more complex, right? Because you have two individuals who are physically joined together,
Right.
but who have separate consciousnesses, separate identities.
And I think the character of Golyadkin in The Double is a great example of this, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's this incredibly unsettling story where a man encounters his literal double who seems to be taking over his life.
And it's like this metaphysical comedy almost.
Yeah, it's this really strange blend of the absurd and the terrifying. And I think it gets at this very deep anxiety that we all have about, the stability of our own identity.
Right. And Morrison makes this really interesting point that for Dostoevsky, what truly makes us human is not just consciousness, but this kind of self-consciousness that we call humiliation.
Yeah, I think that's a really profound insight, right? That it's in those moments of vulnerability, of of social awareness, of feeling like we've fallen short of some standard, that we become most acutely aware of our own humanity. It's like it's our capacity for shame that really sets us apart.
Yeah, I think there's something to that, and it really challenges us to think beyond these kind of purely rational or biological definitions of what it means to be human.
Right. Right. So moving on from this question of identity and consciousness, the collection also delves into the concepts of interiority and intersubjectivity in Dostoevsky's work.
Yes, and so interiority is just, our inner lives, our
Mm.
thoughts, our feelings, our perceptions.
Right.
And intersubjectivity is this idea that our identities are actually formed through our interactions and relationships with
All
others.
right. So we're not just these isolated individuals, but we're constantly being shaped by the people around us.
Exactly. And Corrigan's essay really focuses on this tension between the indwelling self and the relational self in Dostoevsky's work.
And he uses the relationship between Vasya and Arkady in Poor Folk as a kind of early example of this.
Yeah, so Poor Folk is Dostoevsky's first novel. And it's this really interesting epistolary novel where, the two main characters are writing letters to each other, and their relationship is very intense, very intimate, almost suffocating in a way.
Right.
And Corrigan argues that, this kind of intense closeness can actually be very dangerous in Dostoevsky's world because it can lead to oneself being kind of subsumed by the other.
Right. So it's almost like a kind of psychological vampirism.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And
Yeah.
and this idea of oneself being consumed by another, it comes up again and again in Dostoevsky's work.
Right. And the motif of pretend sleep that recurs in his novels seems to be kind of a symbol of this.
Yeah, it's this really interesting idea, right? That sometimes we pretend to be asleep in order to escape the demands of others, to create this kind of illusion of privacy or autonomy.
Right.
But even in sleep, right, we're not fully in control of ourselves.
Right. So it's this kind of unsettling image of the fragility of the self.
And the unstable nature of identity,
Right.
Especially in the context of these intense intersubjective relationships.
So another really interesting theme that comes up in these essays is this idea of angelic and demonic figures in Dostoevsky's novels.
Yeah, and so, we have the obvious good and evil characters, right?
Right.
But Oakland's essay takes a really interesting look at some of the more marginal figures like Kalganov and the Brothers Karamazov, and he sees these characters through the lens of what he calls angelic ontology.
So what does that mean?
Well, it's basically, the study of the nature of angels, right? And he suggests that these characters often embody qualities like transitoriness, incompleteness, and this kind of surplus of being that doesn't quite fit neatly into the human realm.
So someone like Kalganov, who seems almost incidental to the main plot of the Brothers Karamazov, could actually have this much more profound, even angelic role.
Exactly. And Oakland proposes this really interesting idea that maybe Kalganov's very marginality, his seeming lack of a defined purpose in the story, is actually what makes him so important.
Right. So he's like this kind of catalyst or a silent observer who helps to bring about these transformations in the other characters.
Yeah, I think that's a really intriguing way to look at it, and it suggests that even the seemingly minor characters in Dostoevsky's novels can have this kind of hidden significance.
Right. And Goldstein's analysis of Porfiry Petrovich in Crime and Punishment as a Socratic midwife is another really great example of this.
Oh yeah, this is one of my favorite interpretations of Porfiry. And what Goldstein is arguing is that, Porfiry is not just a clever detective who's trying to catch a criminal.
Right.
He's actually functioning as this kind of spiritual guide for Raskolnikov.
And he compares him to Socrates.
Yeah, because just like Socrates, Porfiry doesn't directly impart knowledge
Right.
or accuse Raskolnikov outright. He uses these carefully constructed verbal traps. He uses psychological pressure. He feigns naivete. And all of this is designed to kind of force Raskolnikov to confront his own guilt.
Right. To kind of give birth to his conscience.
Exactly. And the midwife metaphor is so apt here, right? Because, a midwife doesn't actually give birth to the baby.
Right.
But she helps to facilitate the process. She guides the mother through this very difficult and painful experience.
And that's exactly what Porfiry is doing for Raskolnikov.
Exactly. He's guiding him through this process of acknowledging his guilt, of coming to terms with what he's done, and hopefully, achieving some kind of redemption.
And Goldstein even connects this to Plato's idea of a beloved acting as a midwife for the lover's intellectual and spiritual progeny.
Yeah, that's a really interesting connection, right? Because, for Plato, the true lover is not just interested in physical pleasure,
Right.
but in helping the beloved to give birth their highest potential.
Right, and Porphyry's kind of doing that for Raskolnikov in a way.
Exactly. He's helping him to confront the darkest parts of himself and to hopefully emerge from that experience transformed.
So moving on to another really interesting essay, Apollonio explores the theme of solitary confinement in Dostoevsky's work, and he focuses particularly on notes from underground and notes from the House of the Dead.
Yeah, and Apollonio's point is that, Dostoevsky uses the literal and metaphorical experience of isolation to explore the nature of selfhood and consciousness.
And he points out this paradox, right? That solitude can be both salutary and incredibly destructive.
Yeah, it's this double-edged sword, right?
Oh,
On
yeah.
one hand, solitude can be a space for introspection, for spiritual growth, for really getting to know yourself.
Right,
But on the other hand, it can also be a source of immense psychological suffering.
right.
And Dostoevsky calls this, solitary confinement within a crowd.
Right, this feeling of being totally alone even when you're surrounded by people.
Exactly. And I think, the underground man is the quintessential figure of isolation in literature.
Right, he's this alienated, misanthropic character who just can't seem to connect with anyone.
And Apollonio argues that, the underground man's self-imposed isolation is actually a metaphor for the alienation and fragmentation of modern humanity.
Right, so it's not just about this one character, it's about this broader condition of modern life.
Exactly. And I think we can all relate to this to some extent, right? I mean, I think we've all felt that sense of isolation, that sense of being disconnected from the world around us.
And Apollonio also connects this to Notes from the House of the Dead, which is Dostoevsky's account of his own experience in a Siberian prison camp.
Right. And so he's suggesting that, Notes from Underground is kind of like the internal perspective on solitary confinement.
Right, the psychological experience of it.
Exactly. And then Notes from the House of the Dead is the external perspective, right? That the actual physical reality of being imprisoned. And I think by juxtaposing these two works, Dostoevsky is really trying to show us the full horror of isolation, both internal and external.
And this brings us to Medzhibovskaya's chapter, which is all about Dostoevsky's views on education and his ideas about Russian national identity.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting angle, and Medzhibovskaya argues that, for Dostoevsky, education wasn't just about, acquiring knowledge or skills.
Right.
It was about the formation of character, the cultivation of the soul.
And he saw this as being essential for the future of Russia.
Absolutely. He believed that Russia had this unique spiritual mission in the world,
Right.
and that education was the key to fulfilling that mission.
And his commitment to Pakvenichestvo, or soil ideology, is really central to this, right?
Yeah, so Pakvenichestvo was this movement that emphasized the importance of connecting with Russia's native traditions, its soil, and its people.
Right. And Dostoevsky was a big believer in this idea of synthesizing, Russia's unique spiritual heritage with the intellectual and cultural achievements of Western Europe.
Exactly. He thought that Russia had this incredible capacity for synthesis, for bringing together these different strands of thought and creating something new.
Right, and Medzhibovskaya connects this to Hegel's idea of Aufhebung, which is this process of overcoming contradictions by integrating them into a higher unity.
Yeah, that's a really interesting connection, and I think it gets at this deep sense of possibility that Dostoevsky had about Russia's future.
Right, this idea that Russia could somehow transcend the divisions of East and West and create this new kind of civilization.
Exactly, and I think that's part of what makes him so fascinating to read today, because he's asking these really big questions about the nature of identity, the role of culture, the meaning of history.
And finally, the collection also touches on Dostoevsky's relationships and comparisons with other literary and philosophical figures. And I think these are really important for helping us to understand his place in the broader intellectual landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't really understand Dostoevsky in isolation, right? You have to see him in dialogue with the other thinkers of his time. And so, for example, Orwin draws this really interesting parallel between Raskolnikov and Svidrigailov and the figure of Achilles from the Iliad.
Right.
And he's pointing out, this kind of heroic but also destructive individualism that all three of these facets embody.
Right.
And then Mearson offers this this really rich interpretation of Raskolnikov's psychological journey through the lens of the biblical story of the Binding of Isaac.
Right.
And he's highlighting these themes of sacrifice and potential rebirth.
And Kostolevsky's analysis of epileptic time in The Idiot is also really fascinating.
Yeah, he connects it to these both earthly and transcendent notions of time. And he even draws this parallel